Now today I want to talk to you about these Freewell ND filters for the Mini 3 Pro. Just a quick disclosure, Freewell did actually send me these ND filters to test out, although they have no say in this video whatsoever. I've actually been a big fan of Freewell over the years. I've used them on all the drones that we've owned, including the Aspire 2, the Phantom 4 Pro, and the Mavic 2 Pro as well. So I was very excited when they asked me if I wanted to test them out on the Mini 3 Pro. They actually ended up sending me 2 packs. I was expecting just one, but quite excitingly, I've got the Bright Day pack, and that is the one that you see the link down below. But also we've got the longer exposure pack as well. So this is something you can use to get some really creative looks by doing like 2-3 second long exposures in the middle of the day. So you can really blur out the movement in the shot. Now, when I got the DJI Mini 3 Pro, I actually picked up a set of the official DJI ND filters because I was desperate to get some and they were the only ones available at the time. However, I'm not a big fan of these and I'll explain more later on. First off, let's talk about the build quality of these ND filters. And I've got to say, I am really impressed. Considering they're for a consumer drone, so to speak, and they're so tiny, the actual build quality of each filter is really solid. They feel a lot solid than actually other ND filters I've used for drones in the past. It doesn't feel like they're going to fall apart when you're trying to put them on and off all the time. With the polarizer filters, the actual movement is nice and solid. It doesn't feel loose. It doesn't feel like it's going to move around a lot when it's flying. So you can just set your polarizer to the right angle and away you go. So why do you need ND filters for the Mini 3 Pro? Well, it's because the Mini 3 Pro has that fixed 1.7 aperture, a very bright wide aperture, which means that you have to really crank the shutter speed up really high if you want to get the exposure correct. Now in photography, that's not a problem, but when it comes to video, you actually want some motion blur to make the video feel much more natural. It's not always a big deal. If you're flying very high or moving very slow, then there isn't much motion blur going on in the image anyway. However, you do want some motion blur just to keep things feeling smoother and more cinematic. Now, I do find that using the Mini 3 Pro, because of that fixed aperture, you do find yourself quite limited, especially on a mixed cloudy day. So when the sun's coming in and out, or even when it's just a bit hazy and conditions just slightly change and you have to keep adjusting. Unfortunately, the only 2 options you have is adjusting your ISO or adjusting your shutter speed. Now, of course, before you take off, you could select the perfect ND to get the exact 180-degree rule with your shutter. The problem I find though is once you've taken off and if it goes a little bit darker, suddenly you don't have any spare room there to gain exposure. Yes, you could bump the ISO up, but that's not really a great option when it comes to these drones. So for me, I actually like to use a slightly weaker ND when flying the Mini 3 Pro. Just keeping that shutter speed, you know, at 90-degree shutter rather than 180, for example. Yes, it's not perfect, it's not ideal. Ideally, you'd always want 180-degree shutter. But for me, I think just giving you that little bit of wiggle room so that if the exposure changes in the scene, you don't need to come down and land and change the NDs every single time. To be honest, in most shots, you're really not going to notice that slight difference, as long as the shutter speed isn't really high and giving you a very stuttery image. So how good is the image quality with these ND filters? Well, when looking at them side by side with ND on and ND off, I have to say it looks great. There's no real loss of sharpness, everything looks great. The only thing I have noticed with the polarizer filters is there is a slight green tint. It's very slight, it's over the whole image. I think it's quite easy to correct and bring back to looking normal as well. And certainly if you're using these filters all the time, then it's just going to be the image that you always work with. So that slight green tint of the image isn't going to be a real problem. When it comes to the long exposure pack and the UV filter as well that they had sent, there doesn't seem to be any shift in color at all actually. They are very neutral indeed. However, because these are much stronger, you're not going to really be using them when shooting video unless it's a hyperlapse. So let's talk about these long exposure ones and how you can use them creatively. Well, of course, you could do a long exposure image, and I had a go here. Unfortunately, it wasn't really quite bright enough and there wasn't quite enough movement in the water to get something really exciting, despite using an ND 2000, which is absolutely crazy that you can put that on a drone, and doing about a 2-second exposure. Now, obviously I could have got a lot closer and that would have helped with adding to the blur. And yes, you could hope for a day where maybe the waves were a bit stronger. However, that does bring up another issue when using a drone trying to do a long exposure, especially one that is this small. Of course, the more windy it is, the more movement you're going to have with the drone. It is so tiny, it is going to get buffered in the wind, and that of course is going to then affect how good and how sharp the image you get from your long exposure is. Another great use for these long exposure NDs would of course be for hyperlapses. So by using that long exposure, you can get some really cool fast movement shots while also doing a hyperlapse or time lapse from the air. And actually maybe that is where it's more useful than doing photography, because photography you're going to really notice the lack of sharpness unless the conditions are absolutely perfect. Whereas with hyperlapse, you're going to have that movement anyway, so you're probably going to get away with the additional blur of the whole scene, as well as of course the extra long blurs for the fast moving things like traffic or waves. When it comes to the Bright Day pack, you get a really good selection of strengths of ND, everything from a standard clear polarizer filter all the way up to 64 ND with polarizer as well, and everything in between. So a nice sort of gradient throughout, and I find that this is the pack that's probably ideal for most people when shooting video. In this early morning sunrise shot, I was actually using ND4, and it was just enough to bring down that harsh exposure from the sun first thing in the morning. I found even when I was shooting abroad with this drone and these ND filters, that 64 and 32 generally was more than enough. I didn't really feel that I needed more ND when flying the drone, even in midday sun abroad. There might be occasions and certain angles where maybe you're filming a bright building, for example, where 128 ND would be useful. However, as I mentioned earlier, I think you do run the risk of then really being on the limit of your shutter speed unless you start pushing up the ISO if suddenly the weather slightly changes. So generally I would recommend probably using 32 and 64 ND most of the time with your Mini 3 Pro. Now this brings me back to why I wasn't a fan of the DJI ND filters that I got for my drone initially. And well, it's nothing to do with the filters themselves. They're absolutely fine and the price is fine for what they do. However, it is the case that they put them in. It is this really cheap plasticky case with a latch that really does feel like it's going to snap at any time. But what's even more annoying is the fact that actually when you take your standard filter off the drone and you want to store it in here, it's too big. It's actually thicker than the ND filters that DJI provide, which is really strange why, especially their own brand, they don't actually fit in their own case. And of course, that is really annoying. You know, you might be flying all day during the day, obviously, and you want NDs on your drone, but you also want to store your standard filter so you don't lose it because it's so tiny. But it just doesn't fit in the case as standard. What's actually cool is the Freewell case, which is amazing. This is actually a feature that I need to even mention, is the fact they've actually made it thick enough. So the polarizer filter with the Bright Day pack, the ND filters are about the same thickness as the standard filter that is on the Mini 3 Pro. So it makes it ideal when you want to put one of these filters onto the drone and you want to store your standard filter somewhere because it can sit in the case nice and secure. And this case itself is much more solid and feels much better, and it fits neatly into the back of the Fly More bag. I think the UV filter is also a great option to pick up for the Mini 3 Pro. The standard filter that the Mini 3 Pro comes with doesn't have anything to protect the lens on the front of it. So having a UV filter on the front seems like a really sensible option, even if it is just to stop a bug landing on the lens. So there you go, the Freewell Brighter Day ND Filter Pack. These are awesome NDs and I highly recommend picking them up for your Mini 3 Pro. I think also the creativity you can do with the long exposure pack is also really cool. I'd say it's less critical and not such a thing that you really must pick up, but certainly I think the Bright Day pack is an obvious choice when it comes to ND filters for the drone. I hope you found this video useful. Let me know if you've got any creative ideas on how I could use these long exposure ones, maybe for a clever hyperlapse or something that you could think of, and I'll try and include it in my Mini 3 drone review, which will be coming at some point later this year. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe as it massively helps me out. Thank you very much for watching and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.